Standing in that church doorway, watching 200 wedding guests rise to their feet in thunderous applause while my daughter stared in shock, I realized that sometimes the people who try to erase you from their story end up making you the hero of it instead. My name is Paula Henson, and I'm about to tell you how the most painful rejection of my life became the moment I discovered just how many lives I'd actually touched. It's the story of how my daughter's attempt to hide me from her new social circle backfired in the most spectacular way possible, and how sometimes the respect you think you lack has been building around you for years without you even knowing it. I'm 58 years old and have spent the last 32 years working as a nurse practitioner at Chicago General Hospital. I've delivered babies at 3 a.m., held the hands of dying patients, worked through holidays and weekends, and sacrificed more than I can count to give my daughter Sophia every opportunity I never had. But to Sophia's new in-laws, the wealthy Keeley family, I was nothing more than an embarrassing reminder of working-class origins that needed to be hidden away. For months, leading up to Sophia's wedding, I watched my own daughter slowly erase me from the most important day of her life. Wedding planning meetings happened without me. Dress shopping trips excluded me. Family dinners were scheduled when I was working. And finally, 3 weeks before the ceremony, Sophia delivered the blow that nearly destroyed me. "Mom, I think it would be better if you didn't come to the wedding. Your presence might make things awkward with Preston's family and their friends." What Sophia didn't know, what the Keeley family couldn't have imagined, was that the woman they considered too embarrassing to include had spent 3 decades earning the respect and gratitude of hundreds of people throughout Chicago. Patients whose lives I'd saved, families I'd comforted during their darkest hours, colleagues who'd witnessed my dedication and skill, community members who knew exactly who Paula Henson was and what she stood for. The day of the wedding, as I sat in my empty house in my best dress with nowhere to go, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to attend my daughter's wedding, invited or not to cause a scene, not to embarrass anyone, but because no force on earth was going to keep me from witnessing the most important day in my child's life, even if I had to watch from the very back of the church. What happened when I walked through those church doors was something none of us could have predicted. As I stepped into that beautiful sanctuary, filled with flowers that I'd helped pay for through years of overtime shifts, something extraordinary began to unfold. One person recognized me, then another, then another. Slowly, like a wave building momentum, wedding guests began to stand up, not for the bride, not for some ceremonial tradition, but for me. Dr. James Chen, my colleague from the hospital, was the first to rise, followed by the Martinez family, whose premature baby I'd helped save 5 years ago. Then Mrs. Thompson, whose husband I'd comforted during his final hours, stood with tears in her eyes. The Mitchell family, whose teenage son I'd treated after a car accident, rose together. Patient after patient, family after family, people whose lives I'd touched in ways both small and profound, stood up in acknowledgement of a woman they respected, valued, and remembered. But the most shocking moment came when Father Miguel Santos, the priest officiating the ceremony, stopped the wedding entirely when he saw me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the stunned congregation, "before we continue, I need to acknowledge someone very special who has just joined us. Paula Henson, the woman standing in the back, saved my mother's life 3 years ago during a medical emergency. I've been hoping to find her to thank her properly, and God has brought her here today." The silence in that church was deafening as Sophia realized that the mother she'd been ashamed of was being honored by a room full of people who knew her true worth. The Keeley family, who had spent months dismissing me as socially inadequate, watched in stunned disbelief as their wedding guests, many of whom were from their own social circle, showed more respect for me than they ever had. Preston's mother, Carol Keeley, had orchestrated my exclusion based on her belief that I wasn't good enough for their family's image. She'd convinced Sophia that having a nurse practitioner for a mother would somehow diminish their social standing among Chicago's elite. What she discovered that day was that many of the people she was trying to impress already knew me, already respected me, and considered my absence from the wedding a glaring oversight rather than a social necessity. As Father Santos invited me to take a seat in the front row, the place that should have been mine all along, I looked at my daughter and saw the moment she finally understood what she'd almost thrown away. Not just my presence at her wedding, but the respect and admiration I'd earned through decades of service to others. The mother she'd hidden away wasn't an embarrassment to be managed, but a woman whose reputation preceded her in the best possible way. That walk down the aisle to the front row, past 200 people who had stood up to honor me, was the longest and most powerful moment of my life. It was validation that the work I'd done, the sacrifices I'd made, and the life I'd lived had meaning far beyond what I'd ever imagined. It was proof that respect isn't determined by bank account balances or social connections, but by how you treat people when they need you most. But this story isn't just about that triumphant moment in the church. It's about the 32 years of work that led to it, the relationship with my daughter that was nearly destroyed by outside influences, and the lesson we all learned about what really matters when you strip away pretense and social climbing. It's about how sometimes the people who try to diminish you end up creating the circumstances that reveal your true worth to everyone watching. Let me take you back to the beginning, to understand how a single mother working double shifts in a hospital became someone whose absence from a high society wedding was noticed by enough people to create a standing ovation. Because the real story isn't about one dramatic moment. It's about thousands of small moments of compassion, professionalism, and dedication that built a reputation I never knew I had. This is the story of how my daughter's rejection became my validation, how a wedding almost destroyed a relationship that took decades to build, and how sometimes the love and respect you've earned is more powerful than the love and respect you've been denied. It's about learning that you can't control how people perceive you, but you can control how you show up for others, and that consistency of character eventually creates a legacy that speaks for itself. The woman who walked into that church uninvited and unwanted walked out knowing that she was valued, respected, and loved by more people than she'd ever realized. And the daughter who had tried to erase her mother from her special day learned that some people can't be erased because their impact on the world is too significant to ignore. To understand how my relationship with Sophia deteriorated to the point where she didn't want me at her wedding, you need to understand our story from the beginning. Sophia and I had been a team for most of her life, especially after her father, my husband Michael, was killed in military service when she was 12 years old. Michael was a staff sergeant in the Army, deployed to Afghanistan during what we thought would be his final tour before retirement. We'd planned for him to come home, transition to civilian work, and maybe finally take that family vacation we'd been postponing for years. Instead, I got a visit from 2 officers in dress uniforms who changed our lives forever, with news of an IED explosion that took Michael and 3 other soldiers. At 44 years old, I became a widow with a 12-year-old daughter, a mortgage I could barely afford on my nurse's salary, and grief so overwhelming that some days I could barely function. But Sophia needed me to be strong, so I learned to cry in hospital supply closets during my breaks, and put on a brave face when I came home to help her with homework and make dinner. Those early years after Michael's death were financially brutal. Military survivor benefits helped, but they weren't enough to maintain the lifestyle we'd had when Michael was alive. I picked up extra shifts whenever possible, working nights and weekends to make ends meet. I'd often work a 12-hour shift at the hospital, come home to check on Sophia and help with homework, then go back for another shift. Despite our financial struggles, I was determined that Sophia would have every opportunity to succeed. I wanted her to go to college, to have choices I'd never had, to build a life where she wouldn't have to worry about money the way I did. So when she expressed interest in attending St. Catherine's Preparatory Academy, a prestigious private school that would give her access to better college opportunities, I found a way to make it happen. The tuition at St. Catherine's was more than I made in 4 months, but they offered a partial scholarship for children of military families, and I worked extra shifts to cover the rest. I picked up weekend shifts in the emergency room, worked holidays when other nurses wanted to be with their families, and took on additional responsibilities that came with small pay increases. Sophia thrived at St. Catherine's. She was smart, motivated, and popular with both teachers and classmates. She excelled in academics, participated in student government, and began developing the confidence and social skills that would serve her well in college and beyond. Watching her succeed made every extra hour I worked worth it. But I also noticed that Sophia was becoming increasingly aware of the economic differences between our family and her classmates' families. Her friends had mothers who didn't work or who had prestigious careers as lawyers, doctors, or business executives. They lived in large houses in wealthy neighborhoods, took expensive vacations, and seemed to have unlimited resources for clothes, activities, and college preparation. Sophia never complained about our circumstances, but I could see her making comparisons. She'd mentioned casually that Ashley's family was going to Europe for spring break, or that Jennifer's mother was organizing a charity gala, or that Madison's family had bought a vacation home in Michigan. These weren't complaints exactly, but they were observations that made me aware she was noticing the disparity. During high school, I tried to ensure that Sophia could participate in the same activities as her classmates. When the school organized trips to college campuses, I worked extra shifts to pay for them. When she wanted to attend school dances or social events, I found ways to buy appropriate dresses and accessories. When her friends were getting expensive prom dresses, I saved for months to give her the same experience. College brought new financial challenges. Sophia was accepted to Northwestern University with a partial academic scholarship, but the remaining costs were still substantial. I took out loans, worked even more overtime, and made sacrifices that Sophia might not have even noticed. I drove my 15-year-old car for 4 more years, postponed necessary home repairs, and basically eliminated any personal spending that wasn't essential. But I was proud to do it. Watching Sophia graduate from Northwestern with a degree in marketing and land a good job at a respected Chicago firm felt like validation of every sacrifice I'd made. She was launched into the world with opportunities and advantages that would have been impossible if her father and I hadn't invested everything in her education. For the first few years after college, Sophia and I maintained the close relationship we'd always had. She'd call regularly, visit for dinner on Sundays, and include me in her social activities when appropriate. She seemed grateful for the sacrifices I'd made, and proud of what we'd accomplished together despite our challenges. The change began when Sophia started dating Preston Keeley during her 2nd year at her marketing firm. Preston was everything I wanted for Sophia in terms of character. He was intelligent, ambitious, and seemed to genuinely care about her. But he came from a world that was completely foreign to both of us. The Keeley family owned a successful investment firm that had been in the family for 3 generations. They lived in a mansion in Lake Forest, belonged to exclusive country clubs, and moved in social circles where wealth and status were not just advantages, but expectations. Preston's mother, Carol Keeley, was a fixture on charity boards and social committees, the kind of woman whose name appeared regularly in the society pages of Chicago magazines. At first, Preston seemed unaffected by our economic differences. He was respectful to me, interested in hearing about my work, and appreciative of the home-cooked meals I'd prepare when he joined us for Sunday dinners. He'd ask thoughtful questions about my experiences as a nurse, and he seemed to understand and respect the sacrifices I'd made to raise Sophia. But as their relationship became more serious, I began to notice subtle changes in Sophia's behavior. She started mentioning Preston's family activities, charity galas, country club events, vacation trips to the family compound in the Hamptons, with a kind of awe that suggested she was being exposed to a lifestyle she'd never imagined. When Preston proposed after 18 months of dating, I was genuinely happy for them. He seemed to love Sophia for who she was, and she was clearly smitten with him. But I also sensed that the engagement would bring new challenges as Sophia became more integrated into the Keeley family's world. Those challenges materialized almost immediately during the wedding planning process. Carol Keeley took charge of organizing what she described as the social event of the season, with a guest list that included Chicago's most prominent families, business leaders, and social figures. The budget for the wedding was more than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. Initially, I tried to contribute what I could to the wedding expenses, but it quickly became clear that my financial contribution would be insignificant compared to what the Keeley family was spending. More concerning was the gradual realization that Carol Keeley didn't see me as an asset to the family, but as a liability to be managed. The first signs were subtle. Wedding planning meetings would be scheduled during my work hours, with apologies that they couldn't find a time that worked for everyone. Dress shopping trips would be planned as spontaneous mother-daughter outings that somehow never included me. Family dinners at the Keeley house would be scheduled for times when I was working, with regrets that they wished I could be there. When I tried to discuss these patterns with Sophia, she'd minimize my concerns or offer explanations that sounded reasonable but felt hurtful. "Carol is just used to planning these things efficiently," she'd say, or, "It's easier to make decisions quickly when there are fewer people involved." But I could see the changes in Sophia herself. She started talking differently, using phrases and expressions that sounded like they came from her new social circle. She became more conscious of appearance and status, commenting on things like restaurant choices, clothing brands, and social connections in ways that suggested she was adopting new values. The most painful part was watching Sophia become embarrassed by aspects of our life that I'd always been proud of. She'd change the subject when Preston's friends asked about my work, describing me vaguely as being in healthcare, without mentioning that I was a nurse practitioner. She'd avoid bringing Preston to our modest house, preferring to meet him at restaurants or at his family's home. When I tried to address these changes directly, Sophia would become defensive, insisting that she wasn't embarrassed by me, but was just trying to navigate a new social environment. "It's not about being ashamed," she'd say. "It's about understanding how to fit into different contexts." But I could see that the Keeley family's values were influencing her perspective on our life together. The sacrifices I'd made were being reframed as disadvantages to overcome rather than evidence of love and commitment. The financial struggles we'd navigated together were becoming sources of embarrassment rather than examples of resilience. The wedding planning process became increasingly painful as I was systematically excluded from decisions about my daughter's most important day. I wasn't consulted about the venue, the menu, the flowers, or any of the details that I'd imagined we'd planned together. When I'd ask about wedding-related topics, Sophia would give me vague updates or change the subject entirely. 3 weeks before the wedding, everything came to a head during what I thought would be a simple conversation about my outfit for the ceremony. I'd bought a beautiful navy blue dress and wanted to show it to Sophia to make sure it was appropriate for the venue and the formality of the event. "Mom," Sophia said, after barely glancing at the dress, "I need to talk to you about something important." The tone of her voice told me that whatever she was about to say would be difficult to hear. Carol has been thinking about the guest list and the seating arrangements, and she's concerned that some of the guests might not understand our family situation. "What do you mean by our family situation?" Sophia looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as she spoke. She thinks it might be confusing for people to understand the different backgrounds that are coming together through this marriage. She's worried that it might create awkward conversations or uncomfortable moments during what should be a celebration. "Sophia, are you saying that Preston's mother doesn't want me at your wedding?" "It's not that she doesn't want you there. It's just that she thinks it might be better if the focus stayed on Preston and me, without any distractions or complications." The words felt like physical blows. My own daughter was telling me that my presence at her wedding would be a distraction or complication. "And what do you think?" I asked. The pause before her answer told me everything I needed to know, but her words made it even worse. "I think maybe she's right. Maybe it would be easier for everyone if you sat this one out." That conversation ended with Sophia asking me not to attend the wedding that I'd sacrificed years of my life to make possible. The daughter I'd raised alone, educated through tremendous financial sacrifice, and loved unconditionally, had decided that her mother wasn't good enough to witness the most important day of her life. But what neither Sophia nor the Keeley family understood was that Paula Henson had spent 32 years earning respect from people who mattered far more than Chicago's social elite. And 3 weeks later, at a wedding I wasn't supposed to attend, they were all about to find out exactly how wrong they'd been about who I really was. The 3 weeks following Sophia's devastating request that I not attend her wedding were the most painful of my life. Every day, I woke up with the reality that my own daughter considered me too embarrassing to include in the most important moment of her life. But as the hurt settled into something deeper, I began to understand that this rejection wasn't really about me. It was about the insidious influence of people who measured worth by wealth and status rather than character and integrity. The exclusion had been building for months, orchestrated with surgical precision by Carol Keeley, who had apparently decided from the moment Preston announced his engagement that I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be welcomed. What I initially attributed to scheduling conflicts and miscommunications, I now realized had been a deliberate campaign to erase me from my daughter's wedding narrative. The pattern had started subtly during the early wedding planning stages. When Sophia and Preston first announced their engagement, I'd naturally assumed I'd be involved in planning the celebration. After all, I was the bride's only parent, and traditionally that meant I'd have a significant role in organizing the ceremony and reception. But Carol Keeley had other ideas. The first wedding planning meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon when I was working a shift at the hospital. When I suggested alternative times that would work with my schedule, Carol explained that the venue coordinator was only available during weekday business hours, and it was important to move quickly to secure the best dates and vendors. "I understand that Paula's work schedule is demanding," Carol said to Sophia during a phone call that I overheard. "But wedding planning requires flexibility and availability that might be challenging for someone with her professional commitments." The message was clear. My job as a nurse practitioner was an obstacle to proper wedding planning, not a legitimate career that deserved accommodation. In Carol's world, mothers were available for daytime meetings because they either didn't work or had careers that allowed for flexible scheduling. When I suggested that we could meet in the evenings or on weekends to include me in the planning process, Carol's response was politely dismissive. Wedding vendors prefer to meet during regular business hours when they can give their full attention to important decisions. Evening meetings tend to be rushed, and weekend availability is limited for the quality vendors we're considering. The venue selection happened without me. The caterer was chosen during a tasting that was scheduled while I was working a double shift. The florist was selected after a consultation that somehow couldn't accommodate my schedule despite multiple attempts to find a mutually convenient time. Each exclusion came with reasonable explanations that made me feel petty for objecting. When I expressed frustration to Sophia about being left out of these important decisions, she'd reassure me that Carol was just trying to handle the details efficiently, and that I'd be involved in the important decisions later. But those important decisions never materialized. The dress shopping expedition was planned as a spontaneous mother-daughter bonding experience between Sophia and Carol, with no room for a third person. The menu planning was handled as an extension of the catering decision I'd already missed. The music selection was delegated to Preston based on his superior knowledge of what their friends would enjoy. "Paula, you have to understand," Carol explained during one of our rare conversations. "This wedding represents the joining of two families with very different social obligations. The guest list includes board members from Preston's firm, major donors to several charities I'm involved with, and influential families who expect a certain level of sophistication and elegance." The subtext was unmistakable. I didn't possess the sophistication and elegance required for their social circle, and my presence might somehow diminish the event in the eyes of people whose opinions mattered to the Keeley family. When I tried to discuss this with Sophia, she became increasingly defensive about her future mother-in-law's behavior. "Carol isn't trying to exclude you," she insisted. "She's just used to organizing events at a certain level, and she wants everything to be perfect for Preston and me." "But I'm your mother, Sophia. Shouldn't I have some say in planning your wedding?" "Of course you should, but you also have to understand that this wedding is different from what we might have planned if it were just us. Preston's family has connections and expectations that we need to consider." The phrase "just us" stung more than she probably realized. It suggested that our family, the family that had struggled and sacrificed and succeeded together, was somehow insufficient compared to the Keeley family's resources and social connections. As the wedding date approached, the exclusions became more blatant and more painful. The bridal shower was organized as an intimate gathering for close family and friends, but somehow the definition of close family didn't include me. When I asked Sophia about it, she seemed genuinely surprised that I hadn't been included. "I thought Carol had invited you," she said, but when she checked with her future mother-in-law, the response was that they'd assumed I wouldn't be able to attend due to my work schedule. The bachelor and bachelorette parties were planned for the same weekend, with the explicit explanation that it would be easier for out-of-town guests if both events happened simultaneously. But the bachelorette party was organized around activities and venues that required a level of financial investment that put them beyond my budget. Spa treatments at exclusive resorts, dinners at restaurants where entrees cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. When I couldn't afford to participate in some of the planned activities, Carol expressed sympathy for my financial constraints in a way that made it clear she saw my economic limitations as a personal failing rather than the natural result of years of prioritizing my daughter's needs over my own financial security. "It's unfortunate that not everyone can participate in all the pre-wedding festivities," she said to someone during a phone conversation I accidentally overheard. "But we have to plan for the majority of the group and hope others can join when they're able." The rehearsal dinner planning was perhaps the most hurtful exclusion of all. As the mother of the bride, I should have been intimately involved in organizing this event, which traditionally honors both families and gives everyone a chance to come together before the wedding ceremony. Instead, I learned about the details secondhand through Sophia, who seemed uncomfortable discussing an event that had been planned entirely without my input. "It's going to be at the country club," Sophia told me, "with about 60 people. Carol thought it would be nice to keep it intimate and elegant. What can I contribute? Should I help with planning the menu, or coordinating with out-of-town guests, or organizing any special touches?" Sophia's hesitation before answering told me everything I needed to know. Carol has everything handled. She's worked with the club's event coordinator before, and they have a system that works really well for these kinds of dinners. Translation: my help wasn't needed because I wasn't sophisticated enough to plan an event at their level. The final blow came when Sophia and I were discussing my outfit for the wedding. I'd saved money for months to buy a beautiful navy blue dress that I thought was appropriate for the venue and formality of the ceremony. I was excited to show it to Sophia and get her approval, imagining it would be one of the few wedding-related conversations we'd actually have together. But when I brought the dress to her apartment, Sophia barely looked at it before launching into what was clearly a prepared speech. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to listen with an open mind." My heart started racing because I could tell from her tone that whatever she was about to say would be devastating. Carol has been thinking about the wedding day logistics, and she's concerned about some potential complications that could affect how smoothly everything goes. What kind of complications? She thinks having too many family dynamics in play might create distractions from what should be the focus of the day, Preston and me celebrating our marriage. I was confused. "Sophia, I'm your only family. What family dynamics is she worried about?" "It's not about you specifically, Mom. It's about the differences between our background and Preston's family's background. Carol is worried that some of the guests might not understand how to navigate those differences, and it could create awkward moments or uncomfortable conversations." The euphemisms were making me angry. "Just say what you mean, Sophia." She thinks it might be better if the wedding focused on bringing together the families and friends who naturally fit together rather than trying to blend very different social circles. "Are you telling me that I don't naturally fit with your new family?" Sophia's face was flushed with embarrassment, but she continued with what sounded like a script she'd rehearsed. "She thinks, and I'm starting to agree, that maybe it would be less stressful for everyone if you didn't attend the ceremony." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You don't want me at your wedding?" "It's not that I don't want you there. It's that I want the day to be perfect, and Carol thinks having fewer variables to manage would make that more likely." "Variables? Sophia, I'm your mother, not a variable to be managed." "You know what I mean, Mom. This wedding is important for Preston's career, for his family's social connections, for our future opportunities. We can't afford to have anything go wrong." "And you think my presence would make something go wrong?" The pause before her answer was devastating, but her words were even worse. "I think maybe Carol is right. Maybe it would be easier for everyone if you sat this one out." That conversation ended with my daughter asking me to voluntarily exclude myself from the wedding that represented the culmination of everything we'd worked toward together. The child I'd raised alone, sacrificed for constantly, and loved unconditionally, had decided that her mother wasn't good enough to witness her marriage to the man she loved. As I drove home from that conversation, I felt a level of heartbreak I hadn't experienced since Michael's death. But underneath the pain, something else was building, a determination to prove that Paula Henson deserved respect regardless of what the Keeley family thought of her social status. For the next 3 weeks, I wrestled with how to respond to Sophia's request. Part of me wanted to respect her wishes and stay away, painful as it would be. But a bigger part of me knew that missing my daughter's wedding would be a regret I'd carry for the rest of my life, regardless of whether my presence made other people uncomfortable. The decision crystallized when I realized that my exclusion from the wedding wasn't really about protecting Sophia from embarrassment. It was about validating Carol Keeley's prejudices about working-class people and their place in high society. By staying away, I would be agreeing that my 32 years of service as a nurse practitioner, my sacrifices for my daughter's education, and my character and integrity were somehow insufficient compared to inherited wealth and social connections. 3 days before the wedding, I made a choice that would change everything for both Sophia and me. I was going to attend my daughter's wedding, invited or not to cause a scene or create the drama that Carol Keeley was supposedly trying to avoid, but to witness the most important day in my child's life and to represent the values I'd spent a lifetime demonstrating. What I didn't know was that my decision to attend would reveal something that none of us had anticipated, that Paula Henson's reputation in Chicago extended far beyond the world of nursing, and that the respect I thought I lacked had actually been building around me for decades, through the lives I'd touched, the families I'd helped, and the service I'd provided to people who remembered kindness long after the medical crisis had passed. The woman who walked into that church uninvited was about to discover that she was far from alone, and that sometimes the people who try to diminish your worth end up creating the perfect opportunity for your true value to be revealed to everyone watching. The 3 days between making my decision to attend the wedding and the ceremony itself were filled with a strange mixture of determination and terror. I knew I was doing the right thing. No force on earth should keep a mother from witnessing her daughter's wedding. But I also knew that walking into that church uninvited could result in public humiliation unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I spent hours thinking through every possible scenario. Would Carol Keeley have me escorted out by security? Would Sophia be so angry that she'd refuse to continue with the ceremony? Would Preston's family and friends look at me with the disdain that Carol had been expressing privately for months? The possibilities for disaster seemed endless, but the alternative, staying home while my daughter got married, was unacceptable. On Friday morning, 2 days before the wedding, I was working my regular shift in the ICU at Chicago General when something happened that solidified my resolve. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband had been in intensive care for 3 weeks following a massive heart attack, approached me with tears in her eyes. "Paula," she said, grabbing my hands, "I wanted to thank you before Miguel goes home tomorrow. You've been our angel during the worst time of our lives." Miguel Rodriguez had been touch and go for days, and I'd spent countless hours not just managing his medical care, but also supporting his wife and adult children through the crisis. During the long nights when his condition was uncertain, I'd sat with Mrs. Rodriguez, brought her coffee, helped her contact family members, and provided the emotional support that medical situations require, but insurance doesn't cover. "You didn't just take care of Miguel," she continued. "You took care of our whole family. You made sure we understood what was happening. You helped us make difficult decisions, and you never made us feel like we were bothering you with our questions and fears." As she spoke, I realized that this kind of interaction happened regularly in my work, so frequently that I'd stopped thinking of it as extraordinary. But Mrs. Rodriguez's gratitude reminded me that what I did every day, caring for people during their most vulnerable moments, was exactly the kind of service that created lasting respect and appreciation. That afternoon, I called my colleague, Dr. James Chen, who had become a good friend over the 15 years we'd worked together. James was one of the most respected physicians at Chicago General, and his opinion mattered to me both professionally and personally. "James," I said, "I need some advice about a personal situation." I explained the wedding conflict, Carol Keeley's campaign to exclude me, and Sophia's request that I not attend. James listened without interrupting, occasionally making sounds of disbelief or sympathy. "Paula," he said when I finished, This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're one of the most respected healthcare professionals in this city. I've seen you handle medical emergencies with more grace and competence than physicians with twice your experience. The idea that anyone would consider you an embarrassment is absurd. But James, these people move in social circles that value different things than we do. They care about money and status and connections that I've never had. Do you know what I care about when I'm dealing with a medical crisis at 2 a.m? I care about having Paula Henson as my nurse practitioner because I know that whatever happens, you'll handle it professionally and compassionately. I care about having someone who can talk to frightened families with empathy, someone who can make life or death decisions under pressure, someone who treats every patient with dignity regardless of their insurance status or social background. James's words reminded me of something I'd lost sight of during the months of wedding planning drama. I had spent 32 years building a reputation based on competence, integrity, and service to others. That reputation might not impress people who valued inherited wealth, but it had value in the real world, where character mattered more than connections. "You're going to that wedding," James continued, "and you're going to hold your head high, because you have every right to be proud of who you are and what you've accomplished." Friday evening, I called my sister Janet, who lived in Denver and had been following the wedding drama through our regular phone conversations. Janet was 5 years older than me and had always been my sounding board for major decisions. "I've decided to attend the wedding," I told her. "Good," she said immediately. "I was hoping you'd come to your senses about this ridiculous situation." "But I'm terrified, Janet. What if I make things worse for Sophia? What if I cause a scene that ruins her special day?" "Paula, listen to me. You raised that girl by yourself after Michael died. You worked double shifts to pay for her private school education. You took out loans to send her to Northwestern. You've been the most devoted mother I've ever known, and the idea that your presence at her wedding would be inappropriate is insane." Janet reminded me of something I'd been trying not to think about. The financial sacrifices I'd made for Sophia's education were the reason she was able to attract someone like Preston in the first place. Her degree from Northwestern, her social confidence, her ability to navigate professional environments, all of that had been built on the foundation of opportunities I'd provided through years of working extra shifts and postponing my own needs. "Besides," Janet continued, "what's the worst thing that could happen? Some snooty rich people might look down on you. You've dealt with difficult people before. You handle medical emergencies where people's lives hang in the balance. I think you can manage some social disapproval from people whose opinion shouldn't matter to you anyway." Saturday morning, the day before the wedding, I had my hair done at the salon where I'd been going for 10 years. Rosa, my hairdresser, had heard about the wedding situation through the personal conversations that happened during long appointments. "You look beautiful," she said as she finished styling my hair. "Your daughter is lucky to have a mother who loves her enough to be there despite everything that's happened." "I'm not sure she sees it that way right now." "She will eventually. Sometimes we have to do what's right, even when the people we love don't understand it in the moment." Rosa's words resonated with me because they reflected something I'd learned during 32 years of nursing. Sometimes caring for people means making decisions they don't like in the short term, but that serve their best interests in the long term. Maybe attending Sophia's wedding despite her objections was another form of caring for her, ensuring that years from now she wouldn't have to live with the regret of excluding her mother from the most important day of her life. That evening, I tried on my navy blue dress one more time, standing in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom and trying to see myself objectively. I saw a 58-year-old woman who had worked hard, sacrificed much, and earned respect through decades of service to others. I saw someone who deserved to witness her daughter's wedding, regardless of what other people thought about her social status or financial circumstances. But I also saw someone who was about to walk into a potentially hostile environment where she might be unwelcome, unwanted, and publicly humiliated. The courage required to face that possibility felt overwhelming. Sunday morning, the day of the wedding, I woke up early and went through my normal routine with extra care. I showered, styled my hair, applied makeup with more attention than usual, and put on the dress I'd saved months to buy. I looked at myself in the mirror and made a conscious decision to see a woman worthy of respect rather than someone who needed to apologize for her existence. The wedding was scheduled for 2 p.m. at St. Mary's Cathedral, one of Chicago's most beautiful churches. I planned to arrive just as the ceremony was beginning, slip into the back row, and witness my daughter's marriage as quietly and unobtrusively as possible. I wasn't going to announce my presence or create any drama that might disrupt the service. As I drove toward the church, my hands were shaking and my heart was racing, but my resolve never wavered. Whatever happened when I walked through those doors, I would face it with the same dignity and grace I tried to bring to every challenging situation in my professional life. What I didn't anticipate was that St. Mary's Cathedral would be filled with people who knew exactly who Paula Henson was and what she represented. I had no idea that many of the wedding guests were people whose lives I'd touched through my work, families I'd helped during medical crises, colleagues who respected my professional reputation, and community members who had observed my character over the years. I parked 2 blocks away from the church and walked slowly toward the entrance, trying to prepare myself mentally for whatever reception awaited me. As I approached the beautiful stone building, with its soaring spires and stained glass windows, I could hear the organ music beginning and knew that the ceremony was about to start. Standing outside those massive wooden doors, I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was there. Not to prove a point to Carol Keeley, not to embarrass Sophia, not to create drama or seek attention, but to be present for my daughter during the most important moment of her life. Whatever the cost to my own comfort or pride, I was going to witness Sophia's wedding because that's what mothers do. They show up for their children, especially when it's difficult. I opened the church doors and stepped inside, prepared for anything except what actually happened. As I entered that beautiful sanctuary, something extraordinary began to unfold that would change everything Sophia thought she knew about her mother's place in the world, and everything I thought I knew about the respect I'd earned through 3 decades of service to others. The woman who walked into that church uninvited and unwelcome was about to discover that she was far from alone, and that sometimes the people who try to diminish you end up creating the perfect stage for your true worth, to be recognized by everyone who matters. The moment I stepped through the doors of St. Mary's Cathedral, I was struck by the breathtaking beauty of the scene before me. 200 guests filled the pews. The altar was adorned with white roses and gold accents that must have cost more than I made in a month, and soft organ music created the perfect atmosphere for what should have been the most joyful day of my daughter's life. I planned to slip quietly into the last pew and witness the ceremony from the very back of the church, hoping to remain as invisible as possible while still being present for this crucial moment. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure people could hear it, and my hands were trembling as I tried to navigate the center aisle without drawing attention to myself. But as I took my first steps down that aisle, something unexpected happened. A woman in the 3rd row turned around, and I recognized her immediately. It was Carmen Martinez, whose premature baby I'd helped care for in the NICU 5 years ago. Her face lit up with recognition and what looked like genuine joy at seeing me. "Paula," she whispered loudly enough for people around her to hear. "What a wonderful surprise." Her enthusiasm caught the attention of other guests nearby, and I saw several heads turn in my direction. In the fifth row, I spotted Dr. James Chen, my colleague from the hospital, who immediately stood up with a huge smile on his face. Next to him was his wife Linda, whom I'd met at several hospital social events over the years. "Dr. Chen," I whispered as I passed his row, nodding in acknowledgement while trying to continue toward the back of the church. But then something remarkable began to happen. Mrs. Thompson, whose husband I'd comforted during his final hours in the ICU last year, recognized me from her seat near the center of the church. She stood up slowly, her eyes filling with tears, and began to applaud softly. The applause caught the attention of more guests, and I realized with growing amazement that I recognized many of the faces looking back at me. The Williams family, whose teenage daughter I'd treated after a serious car accident. Mr. Peterson, whose wife had been in the ICU for weeks following complications from surgery. The Garcia family, whose elderly father I'd helped transition to hospice care with dignity and compassion. One by one, these people began to stand up, not out of obligation or social convention, but out of genuine recognition and respect for someone they remembered as having made a difference in their lives during difficult times. Carmen Martinez was the first to start clapping, followed by Dr. Chen and his wife. Then Mrs. Thompson's soft applause grew stronger, and the Williams family joined in. The sound began to build throughout the church as more and more people realized what was happening and chose to participate in this spontaneous show of respect. I was frozen in the aisle, completely overwhelmed by what was unfolding around me. This wasn't the quiet entrance I'd planned. This wasn't the invisibility I'd hoped for. This was something I never could have imagined. A public acknowledgement of 32 years of service to others, happening in front of 200 people at my daughter's wedding. From the altar, I could see Sophia's face as she turned to see what was causing the commotion. Her expression went from confusion to shock to something that might have been horror as she realized that her uninvited mother was not only present, but was being honored by a significant portion of her wedding guests. Preston looked equally stunned, his eyes darting between me and the growing number of people who were now standing and applauding. I could see Carol Keeley in the front row, her face a mask of barely controlled fury as her carefully orchestrated wedding was being disrupted by exactly the kind of scene she'd been trying to prevent. But the most amazing moment was still to come. Father Miguel Santos, the priest officiating the ceremony, had been watching the spontaneous demonstration with growing curiosity. As the applause continued and more people stood up, his expression changed from confusion to recognition to something that looked like excitement. He raised his hand to quiet the congregation, and the applause gradually died down as people returned to their seats. But instead of continuing with the ceremony, Father Santos stepped away from the altar and began walking toward me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a voice that carried throughout the cathedral. Before we continue with this beautiful ceremony, I need to acknowledge someone very special who has just joined us. The silence in the church was complete as every eye focused on Father Santos and me. I felt like I was in a dream, or possibly a nightmare, as the priest approached me with a smile that suggested he had something important to say. "The woman standing before us is Paula Henson," he continued, his voice filled with warmth and admiration. 3 years ago, this remarkable woman saved my mother's life. The gasp that went up from the congregation was audible, and I saw Sophia's hand fly to her mouth in shock. Even Carol Keeley seemed taken aback by this unexpected revelation. My mother, Maria Santos, suffered a massive stroke while visiting me here in Chicago, Father Santos continued, his voice becoming more emotional. She collapsed in Grant Park, and by the grace of God, Paula happened to be there during her lunch break from the hospital. I remembered that day clearly now. I'd been eating lunch on a park bench when I heard someone screaming for help. An elderly woman had collapsed, and her son was panicking as bystanders stood around unsure what to do. My nursing training kicked in immediately. I assessed her condition, called 911, and provided emergency care until the paramedics arrived. Paula didn't just provide medical assistance, Father Santos said to the riveted congregation. She rode in the ambulance with us, stayed with our family during the surgery, and checked on my mother's progress for weeks afterward. She treated a complete stranger's family with the kind of compassion and dedication that goes far beyond professional duty. The priest's voice was breaking slightly as he continued. My mother recovered fully, and the doctors said that Paula's quick response and expert care in those crucial first minutes were the difference between life and death. I've been hoping to find Paula again to thank her properly, and God has brought her here today to witness this celebration of love. Father Santos turned to address me directly. Paula, you represent everything that is beautiful about the human spirit: selfless service, professional excellence, and genuine compassion for others. Your presence here today honors this ceremony and everyone in attendance. The silence that followed was profound. In that moment, everyone in the church, including Sophia, Preston, and Carol Keeley, understood that the woman who had been deemed too embarrassing to invite to the wedding was being publicly honored by a priest who considered her a hero. Then Father Santos did something that surprised everyone, including me. Paula, I know that family relationships can be complicated, and I don't know the circumstances that brought you here today. But I believe that God wants you in the front row for this ceremony, in the place of honor that you've earned through a lifetime of serving others. He gestured toward the front of the church, where Carol Keeley sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Keeley, would you please make room for Paula to sit with the family where she belongs? The request wasn't really a request. It was a gentle but firm directive from the officiant of the ceremony. Carol had no choice but to comply, though her expression suggested she was calculating the social cost of this unexpected development. As I walked toward the front of the church, the applause began again, this time even stronger than before. People weren't just clapping politely, they were standing and applauding with genuine enthusiasm for someone they respected and admired. I could see Sophia's face as I approached the front row, and the expression there was unlike anything I'd ever seen from her. It was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, pride, confusion, and what might have been the beginning of understanding about who her mother really was and how she was perceived by people who mattered. Dr. Chen called out, "Paula, you're an inspiration to all of us." The Martinez family was beaming at me like I was a celebrity. Mrs. Thompson was crying openly, clearly moved by the opportunity to show her appreciation publicly. As I took my seat in the front row, the place I should have been all along, Father Santos returned to the altar with a smile that suggested he was delighted by this unexpected opportunity to honor someone he considered worthy of recognition. "Now," he said to the congregation, "let us begin this celebration of love with the understanding that we are witnessed by people who represent the very best of human character and service to others." The ceremony continued with me in the front row, exactly where the mother of the bride should have been from the beginning. But everything had changed. Sophia kept glancing at me throughout the service, her expression still showing the shock of discovering that her embarrassing mother was actually someone who commanded respect and admiration from people throughout Chicago. Preston looked confused, but impressed, clearly trying to reconcile the woman his mother had described as a social liability with the person who had just been publicly honored by a priest and applauded by dozens of wedding guests. But it was Carol Keeley's reaction that was most telling. The woman who had spent months orchestrating my exclusion from the wedding was now sitting next to me in the front row, forced to confront the reality that many of her own wedding guests People from her social circle respected and admired the woman she had dismissed as socially inadequate. During the exchange of vows, I watched my daughter promise to love, honor, and cherish the man she had chosen to build a life with. Despite everything that had happened between us, I felt overwhelming joy at witnessing this moment. Sophia looked beautiful, Preston seemed devoted to her, and the ceremony was everything a wedding should be, a celebration of love and commitment. But I also felt something else. Validation that my decision to attend had been right, not just for me, but for Sophia. Years from now, when she looked back on her wedding day, she would remember not just the conflict that had preceded it, but the moment when she learned that her mother was someone worthy of public honor and respect. When Father Santos pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was thunderous. But as Sophia and Preston kissed and turned to face their guests as a married couple, I saw something in my daughter's eyes that gave me hope for our future relationship. For the first time in months, Sophia was looking at me not with embarrassment or apology, but with something that might have been pride. The mother she had tried to hide from her new social circle had just been revealed as someone who commanded respect from people throughout that very circle. As the recessional began and the wedding party started their walk down the aisle, Sophia broke protocol slightly. Instead of walking straight past the front row, she stopped in front of me, leaned down, and whispered, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Preston, standing beside his new wife, extended his hand to me and said, "Mrs. Henson, it's an honor to have you as part of our family." Even Carol Keeley, though clearly still processing what had happened, managed a tight smile and a nod of acknowledgement that suggested she was beginning to understand how badly she had misjudged the situation. As the wedding party continued down the aisle and the congregation began to file out for the reception, I was surrounded by people wanting to talk to me. Former patients and their families shared stories about how I'd helped them during medical crises. Colleagues from the hospital expressed pride in working with someone of my caliber. Even people I didn't immediately recognize approached to thank me for care I'd provided to their loved ones. Dr. Chen put his arm around my shoulders and said, "Paula, this is exactly why you're one of the most respected healthcare professionals in this city. You treat every patient like family, and people remember that kind of care forever." Walking out of that church, I realized that the respect I thought I lacked had actually been building around me for 32 years through every patient I'd treated with compassion, every family I'd supported during crisis, every colleague I'd helped during difficult situations. The woman who had entered that church uninvited and unwelcome was leaving as an honored guest whose presence had elevated the entire ceremony. And more importantly, my daughter was beginning to understand that the mother she had been ashamed of was actually someone whose character and service had earned admiration from people throughout the community. What happened at the reception that followed would complete the transformation of our relationship and teach both of us lessons about respect, dignity, and family that would last for the rest of our lives. The reception at the Oak Brook Hills Country Club was everything Carol Keeley had envisioned: elegant, sophisticated, and filled with Chicago's social elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with white roses and gold accents. A string quartet played classical music during cocktail hour, and the champagne flowed freely among guests who moved with the easy confidence of people accustomed to luxury. But the atmosphere had changed dramatically from what Carol had planned. Instead of the carefully controlled social gathering she'd orchestrated, the reception had become something more organic and meaningful, a celebration not just of Sophia and Preston's marriage, but of the values that truly matter when you strip away pretense and social positioning. I found myself at the center of conversations I never could have imagined. Former patients and their families approached me throughout the evening to share stories about how my care had affected their lives. Dr. Patricia Williams, a prominent pediatric surgeon whom I recognized from hospital functions, sought me out to tell me about a case where we'd worked together years ago. "Paula, I don't know if you remember this, but 5 years ago we had a child come into the ER with severe injuries from a car accident. The family was terrified, and the little boy was fighting us every step of the way. You spent hours with him, talking him through each procedure, keeping him calm while we worked to save his life." I did remember that case. 8-year-old Marcus, whose fear of medical procedures was making treatment nearly impossible until I sat with him and explained everything in language he could understand. "That child made a full recovery," Dr. Williams continued, "and his parents still talk about the nurse who made the difference between trauma and healing. You didn't just treat his injuries, you treated his fear and his family's panic. That's the kind of nursing that changes lives." As she spoke, I realized that Sophia was standing nearby, listening to a conversation that revealed aspects of my work she'd never fully understood. Her expression showed a mixture of pride and shock as she heard her mother described as someone whose skills were respected by one of Chicago's leading pediatric surgeons. The revelation continued throughout the evening. James Martinez, whose wife had been in the ICU for weeks following complications from surgery, approached our table during dinner to share his story. "Mrs. Henson probably doesn't remember this," he said to the guests at our table, which included Preston's family and several of their close friends. "But she was the nurse practitioner who coordinated my wife's care during the most frightening time of our lives." I remembered Carmen Martinez's case clearly. Multiple complications following what should have been routine surgery, weeks of uncertainty, and a family struggling to understand complex medical information while fearing the worst. "Paula didn't just manage the medical aspects of my wife's care," James continued. "She made sure our children understood what was happening to their mother. She helped us navigate insurance issues that were preventing necessary treatments. She coordinated between multiple specialists to ensure everyone was working together effectively." He turned to address me directly. "Carmen is here tonight, healthy and whole, because you refused to let her be just another case number. You treated our family with dignity and compassion during the worst crisis we'd ever faced." The impact of these stories on the other wedding guests was visible. Preston's colleagues, who had arrived expecting a typical society wedding, found themselves hearing testimonials about character and service that put their own achievements in a different perspective. During the toasts, something unprecedented happened. Father Santos, who was staying for the reception as a family friend, asked for the microphone to share something beyond the traditional wedding blessing. "I know this is unusual," he began, "but today's ceremony has reminded me why we gather to celebrate not just love between two people, but the values that sustain communities and families." He gestured toward me at the head table, where I sat between Sophia and Dr. Chen. "When I think about the qualities we hope to see in marriage, selfless service, dedication to others, grace under pressure, and unwavering commitment, I think about Paula Henson, whose life exemplifies all of these virtues." The room grew quiet as Father Santos continued. "Paula represents the kind of person who makes the world better through daily acts of service and compassion. The fact that she raised a daughter like Sophia, who is beginning her own journey of service and commitment, shows us that the most important inheritances aren't financial. They're moral and spiritual." When he finished speaking, the applause was sustained and heartfelt. But more importantly, I could see the impact of his words on Sophia, who was beginning to understand that the values she'd been taught to see as limitations were actually the foundation of everything meaningful in life. Preston surprised everyone, including his new wife, by asking for the microphone next. "I need to say something about family and what I've learned today," he began, his voice showing emotion that seemed genuine and unscripted. When Sophia and I started planning this wedding, I thought the most important thing was bringing together two families with similar backgrounds and social positions. But today I've learned that the most important thing is bringing together people who share similar values. He looked directly at me as he continued. Mrs. Henson, I owe you an apology. I let other people convince me that differences in background were more important than similarities in character. Today I've learned that you represent exactly the kind of integrity and service that I hope to bring to my marriage with Sophia. The young man who had allowed his mother to exclude me from wedding planning was publicly acknowledging that he'd been wrong about what mattered most in building a family. But the most meaningful moment came when Sophia asked for the microphone to make her own toast. Standing beside her new husband, she looked directly at me with tears in her eyes. I need to apologize to the most important person in my life, she began, her voice breaking slightly. Mom, for the past year I've been so focused on fitting into a new world that I forgot to honor the world that made me who I am. The room was completely silent as Sophia continued. Today, I've heard story after story about my mother's impact on people's lives. I've learned that the woman I was embarrassed to introduce to my new social circle is actually someone who commands respect and admiration throughout Chicago. She paused, clearly struggling with emotion. I asked my mother not to come to my wedding because I was afraid her presence would somehow diminish me in other people's eyes. Instead, I've learned that her absence would have diminished this entire celebration. Sophia turned to address the full room. Every opportunity I've had, every advantage I've enjoyed, every success I've achieved has been built on the foundation of my mother's sacrifices and character. The education that brought me to Northwestern, the confidence that helped me build my career, the values that attracted Preston to me, all of that came from being raised by a woman who showed me every day what service and integrity look like. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The daughter who had tried to hide her mother's background was now publicly celebrating the values and sacrifices that had made her own success possible. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Carol Keeley approached me for the first time since the ceremony. Her expression was difficult to read, part embarrassment, part respect, and something that might have been genuine remorse. Paula, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you based on limited information, and I was wrong about what matters most in determining someone's worth. She paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to someone accustomed to being right about social dynamics. Today I've learned that the respect I thought came from social position actually comes from character and service to others. You have something that can't be inherited or purchased. You have the genuine admiration of people whose opinion should matter most. It wasn't a complete acknowledgement of the pain her actions had caused, but it was more than I'd expected from someone who had worked so hard to exclude me from my daughter's wedding. The conversation that meant the most to me happened during the last dance, when Sophia approached me as I was preparing to leave. Mom, she said, I know I can't undo the past year, but I want you to know that today changed everything for me. I understand now that I was trying to run away from the exact things that make our family special. Sophia, you don't need to apologize for wanting to build a good life with Preston. I've always wanted you to have opportunities I never had. But I almost threw away the most important thing I have, my relationship with the strongest, most admirable woman I know. Preston's family has money and social connections, but you have something more valuable. You have integrity and the respect that comes from a life of service to others. She hugged me tightly, and for the first time in months, it felt like I had my daughter back. Mom, I want to ask you something. Preston and I have been talking, and we want to know if you'd consider moving closer to us. Not because we think you need taking care of, but because we want our future children to grow up knowing their grandmother and learning the values that made you who you are. The invitation represented a complete reversal from the woman who had asked me not to attend her wedding just hours earlier. 6 months later, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I accepted a position as Director of Patient Services at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, a role that would allow me to use my 32 years of experience to improve patient care throughout one of Chicago's premier medical institutions. The job offer came through Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the Chief Medical Officer at Northwestern, who had heard about my work from multiple colleagues and patients over the years. "Paula, we need someone with your experience and reputation to help us maintain the highest standards of patient care while training the next generation of healthcare professionals." The position came with a significant increase in salary and responsibility, but more importantly, it represented recognition that my decades of bedside nursing had prepared me for leadership roles that could impact thousands of patients and dozens of healthcare professionals. Sophia and Preston were thrilled about my new position, not just because it meant I'd be working closer to their home, but because it validated everything they'd learned about my professional reputation on their wedding day. A year after the wedding, Sophia asked me to lunch to share some important news. She was pregnant with their first child. As we sat in a quiet restaurant, she told me something that brought tears to my eyes. "Mom, Preston and I have been talking about the kind of parents we want to be, and we keep coming back to the example you set for me. You showed me that love means sacrifice, that strength means serving others, and that success means making a positive difference in people's lives." She reached across the table to take my hand. "We want to raise our children with the same values you taught me. We want them to understand that respect is earned through character, not inherited through wealth." Today, 3 years after that transformative wedding day, I'm a grandmother to 2 beautiful children who are being raised to value service, integrity, and compassion above social status or material success. Sophia and Preston have become active in several charities that support healthcare access for underserved communities, using their resources and social connections to advance causes that align with the values they learned from our family's story. The relationship between Sophia and me is stronger than it's ever been, built now on mutual respect and shared understanding of what truly matters in life. She no longer sees our financial struggles as something to overcome, but as experiences that taught us resilience, empathy, and the importance of supporting each other through difficult times. Carol Keeley and I have developed a cordial relationship based on her growing understanding that worth isn't determined by bank account balances or social connections. She's never become warm or close, but she treats me with respect and includes me in family gatherings without the tension that marked our early interactions. Most importantly, I've learned that the respect I thought I lacked had actually been building around me for decades through every patient I'd treated with compassion, every family I'd supported during crisis, every colleague I'd helped during difficult situations. The standing ovation I received in that church wasn't a surprise to anyone except me. It was simply a public acknowledgement of 32 years of service that had touched hundreds of lives. The lesson I want to share from this experience is about the difference between respect and approval. I had spent months seeking approval from people whose opinion shouldn't have mattered to me, while ignoring the respect I'd already earned from people whose opinion reflected my true worth. When people try to diminish your value based on their prejudices about class, education, or social status, remember that character and service create a legacy that speaks for itself. You don't need to apologize for honest work, sacrificial love, or values that prioritize people over profit. The daughter who once asked me not to attend her wedding now proudly introduces me to everyone she meets as my mother, who has spent her life serving others and taught me everything I know about what really matters. The woman who tried to exclude me from her son's wedding now seeks my advice about healthcare decisions for her aging parents. Sometimes the people who try to erase you from their story end up creating the perfect opportunity for your true worth to be revealed to everyone watching. And sometimes the rejection that breaks your heart becomes the catalyst for discovering just how many lives you've touched through years of quiet service and compassion. Standing in that church doorway, watching 200 people rise to honor me while my daughter stared in shock, I learned that respect isn't something you beg for or manipulate others into giving you. It's something you earn through consistency of character, service to others, and integrity in everything you do. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're facing social rejection, professional discrimination, or family conflict. Your worth isn't determined by other people's prejudices. It's determined by how you show up for others when they need you most, and sometimes that worth is recognized in ways you never expected by people who matter more than you realized.